Sure. And Kelly, do you want to continue to admit people to you, Kelly, in the session? Awesome. Well, we're gonna wait, just a couple more minutes for a few more people to trickle in. I know we're expecting a few more, so we'll just hang out here for a little bit.
Something popped up in front of me. I didn't know. Where are we?
Can you see us okay, Tom? Is the connection okay?
What's that?
Can you still see us okay? Is the connection okay on your end?
Seems to be okay now.
Perfect. Okay, cool. As long as you can see us. All right, so welcome everyone. So great to see so many faces today from all over, it looks like from all over the US. So we're excited to start with this incredible workshop, and we're honored to have Tom Gilbert with us. I'm gonna turn it over to Marissa Shore, a critical member of our youth team who's gonna be moderating today. So Marissa, I'll turn it over to you and we'll get started for today.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you especially to Tom for agreeing to do this for us. We are super excited to have you being here and talking about the history of the US Biosphere Network and kind of your experiences with that. So I'll just introduce Tom. I know many of you probably know Tom already super well, so it's just gonna be a brief bio. For those of you who don't know him, Tom has been super instrumental in the biosphere regions of the US. He spent a good portion of his life protecting our natural resources. What do you do now? He's bachelor's and his master's from the University of Tennessee, and he's worked tirelessly internationally and nationally for our natural resources, especially with regard to biosphere reserves. He's focused on planning the Southern Appalachian Man of the Biosphere Program, so the SA-MAB Cooperative. And he has worked with the World Network of Biosphere Reserves and the UNESCO Man of the Biosphere Program. He's led delegations for Biosphere Reserves. He is also was the first president of the George Wright Society. So one of our great important partners with the biosphere regions. And he is just super knowledgeable, and I'm sure that's going to come out here in his talk. So he's going to talk a little bit about the history of the biosphere regions in the US, and then we're going to have kind of an open discussion session for any questions you might have, and then, experiences, that sort of thing. So I will turn it over to Tom whenever you're ready. We are excited to hear your wisdom.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to say right in the beginning that I was away for a number of years, and Bill Gregg knows a lot more detail about the history of 15, 20-year period than I do. So he's an authority on a mid-period of the US program. I feel a bit nervous about this because, well, it's a bit like a dream in that I kind of float from one experience to in different scenes, and it goes on and on, and I've lived so long and been in so many places that I figured I better make some notes, and I'm hoping that might keep me on track, because I would like to discuss the history for a while and then have enough time to talk about things that I think that practical things that we could do today. But I'll tell you, when I first started, the first talk that I gave when I was a ranger naturalist back in 1954, this was in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And my dear wife, Patsy, was helping me. And in those days, you know, this the old projectors, you put in one slide at a time. And she was going to help me. And so I went up to do the introduction. And Patsy opened the slide box upside down and they all spilled out on the floor. And so it actually helped because the crowd all was sympathetic. They laughed about it. But as we went through the program, about half the slides were upside down or sideways. And so I hope I'll do better this time. But I did make some notes, and I want to try to keep on track with them. I thought I would start with, there's so many people involved in the Man and Biosphere program, but I'll start with two quotes from two people that I really admired and knew very well. Raymond Dasman, who wrote the book Planet in Peril, Man and Biosphere Today, back in 1972, when the Man and Biosphere program was beginning, he said that it's difficult to be hopeful about the prospects for man and the biosphere. There's always the danger that nations of the world, like the infamous Kilkenny cats of Ireland, that was a limerick. Kilkenny cats of Ireland will keep clawing, scratching, and biting at each other until there's nothing left of them but their tails. But then he said, Sir Frank Fraser Darling, who was a great friend of his, and a fellow I also really admired, he said that Dr. Darling put it as well as anyone could when he addressed the Biosphere Conference. That was in 1968. He said, ecologists can scarcely afford to be optimists, but an absolute pessimist is a defeatist, and that's no good either. We see that there not be complete disaster, and if our eyes were open wide enough worldwide, we could do much toward rehabilitation. Let's think about it. That was 54 years ago. And Dr. Darling also said, time is not on our side. So it really is difficult to be hopeful. But I want to go back to a time when it looked really awfully bad, but there was hope. There was hope at the time that we didn't even imagine. This is 1928, the year I was born. And that was a time, you know, beginning of the Depression. I wish you could have seen the land around my home here in South Knoxville. There were still some forests left, but in large part, the land was pretty barren and eroded. And I actually grew up, as I grew up and walked to grammar school, about a mile away, I would cross the fields and there were deep red clay gullies. I even learned to pole vault to cross some of the smaller gullies. And you wouldn't believe how it looks today in this green land. Well, Franklin Roosevelt started the New Deal, and there were a lot of people in this area that didn't care for Franklin Roosevelt. But looking back on it, and the things that happened, and soil conservation and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it's just a very different land. Much of the Southern Appalachians did recover remarkably. As I say, people in the area today couldn't imagine how it was when I was born. I had the pleasure of going down when I was 12 years old and sitting on a grassy bank and watching FDR come through Knoxville on his way to dedicate the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But there was something else that I didn't know until fairly recently, and I wish I had. But it was in 1928 that leaders of nations around the world gathered in Paris and signed the Paris Peace Pact, which was the first time that leaders of the world agreed to outlaw war. War had been made legal and defended. And this was the beginning of a new world order. Now, of course, we haven't succeeded, but we have, according to this remarkable book called The Internationalists, which was published just last year, I think, by authors from Yale University with a really marvelous research staff around the world. They tell about how, in spite of what it seems, there has been a lot of progress made. And of course, the establishment of the United Nations, Franklin Roosevelt intended to be present at the launching of the United Nations in 1945. But he was so frail coming back from Yalta and the meeting with Churchill and Stalin that he retired to Warm Springs, Georgia. But he had told Eleanor before he went that he intended to be present at the launching of the United Nations. And he kept active, and he penned a message for a radio address just hours before he died. Another thing, though, that this book, The Internationalists, the authors recommend, is that we must keep on working toward peace, supporting institutions and programs that work for peace. And did you know UNESCO was established in 1945 for nations to collaborate toward peace through education, science, and culture. And we had American statesmen like Jack Forbes, who was the Deputy Director General of UNESCO for a number of years, and just really a fine person. And he kept the best he could to UNESCO to keep working toward peace. We pulled out of UNESCO a number of times. We pulled out of UNESCO when I was there. And Jack, when he retired, he lived in Asheville, North Carolina. He formed the organization called Americans for the Universality of UNESCO. It became known as Americans for UNESCO. So, my opinion, we need to do everything we can to support UNESCO and to get back in, because we can do a lot more to help shape programs if we're a part of UNESCO than from it. I'll mention the 1968 Biosphere Conference. Stanley Kane was an ecologist from if I first knew at the University of Tennessee, a pioneering ecologist who worked on the heath balls in the Smokies, but he went on to become the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And he was the rapporteur at the 1968 Biosphere Conference. And he and some other very distinguished scientists like Serrato Frankel, who helped us develop the criteria and guidelines for biosphere reserves. Serrato is sometimes called the high prophet of the genetic resources conservation field. But Stan Kane, who I really admired, said this: "We've come to a period of time in history when there is great need for a multidisciplinary, multi-agency, public-private joint planning. Essentially, it is ecological planning." And I've tried to use that ever since then. He left the University of Tennessee, but he came back for a seminar one time. And I can remember one thing that he said at that time. He said, "Don't have much hope for conservation in this country as long as a person thinks that they have to have a 350 high horsepower 6-passenger car to get one person from home to office." I thought that was pretty shrewd. And I mentioned it later on to the director of the Park Service, George Hartzog, saying, let's establish an energy conservation policy, a small car policy, which we did. Some of the directorate, in fact, there's a guy named Joe Holt, who was a friend of the Nixons. He came up afterwards and said he thought that was the most foolish proposal he'd ever heard. And I guess from some standpoint that it might have been foolish, but we actually got to demonstrate some small cars, subcompact cars, at the Second World Conference on National Parks. Now, that was in 1972. And at that time, I had come back from Africa after spending 4 years in Africa at the College of African Wildlife Management. And Director Hartzog gave me the job of heading the Office of Environmental Interpretation. And so we had the opportunity to put on the interpretive program at the Second World Conference on National Park. And I presented a paper called A Widening Horizon, the Role of National Parks in Education. I didn't even know it at the time, although I read several of his interventions, but Michel Baptiste, Dr. Baptiste from UNESCO Paris, who headed the ecology division and the MAB program, made several requests during the conference for assistance to a new project called Conservation of Natural Areas and of the Genetic Material it contained. And he asked the director, George Hartzog, for assistance. Well, through luck or something, I got the job. And so in 1973, And the first US MAB committee was formed and met, and the chair was Dr. Donald King, a person I thought was just marvelous. We got to be good friends before I went to Paris, and fortunately I was in that meeting before I went to Paris. I remember one time we went over across the street from the State Department to the National Academy of Sciences and heard Dr. Dave Reichel from Oak Ridge National Laboratory talk about the progress in ecosystem sciences. And I quoted some of the things that Dr. Reichel said when I got we did the first publication there in Paris on MAB Project 8. Well, MAB Project 8 became the Biosphere Reserve project. But it was kind of a shock when I got there to Paris to find out that there's an awful lot of talk among the organizations that deal with ecosystem conservation. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. Many thought that the MAB project ought to be handled by IUCN. But in replacing the International Biological Program, it was felt that needed to have governments more involved, and UNESCO was more appropriate. But the organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization and the UN Environment Program, they talked a lot about cooperation, but there was more competition than there was cooperation, particularly for funding. And so that was a big problem. Well, we had the first meeting in IUCN in Moor, Switzerland, and the experts were great. We wrote up a good report. Then the winter, I was working on plans that were way too ambitious, and Michel Baptiste told me so, that we don't have that kind of money, so back to the drawing board. But in the spring of 1954, I was actually Patsy and I were in bed, and I was reading the International Herald Tribune, and it's writing about Nixon, President Nixon, being in Spokane, Washington, to a fair, and he was quoted as saying, "We're going to get our heads together with the Russians." He didn't say Soviets at that time. He said, "We're going to get our heads together with the Russians to protect the environment." So I thought, I wonder what they've got in mind. And so I called Christian Herter Jr., who was the key person in the State Department for Environmental Affairs. He headed the Department of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. And Chris Herter said he didn't know of anything specific. And so I said, why not both of our countries pledge to support the Biosphere Reserve program? And he said,
Okay.
what is it?
So is there any,
What's that?
Sorry, I think it was
Somebody
just an
gave
error.
up right there. You're good. You can continue.
But he, Mr. Herter, he asked, "What is a biosphere reserve, and what do you got in mind?" And so I said, "Well, just think about the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, working with other federal and state agencies and the surrounding communities for a common purpose, like Stanley Kane said, it's an ecological approach." And Herter said, "That sounds like a good idea." Anyway, he bought it, And to the shock of most of us, including me, that actually happened. Nixon and Brezhnev signed this cooperative agreement, and the State Department sent out communiques to a number of countries. And that, up until that time, there just wasn't any funding available. But with Herter's support and a cable to the UN Environment Program, Herter wanted this program funded, and so it broke funding loose. And quite frankly, I think that the Biosphere Reserve program might have gone the way of most of the other MAB projects if it hadn't been for this kind of beginning and support. The Director General of UNESCO wrote to Kissinger about how much it meant to not only the MAB program, but to UNESCO itself. And so I thought, oh boy, we're really off and running. And so we had also, because of this, the United States hosted the third meeting of the International Coordinating Council of MAB. And this was in the fall of 1974. And it was quite a meeting. I mean, we had field trips to a number of places, to meetings in Colonial Williamsburg. We went to Cape Hatteras. The delegates, and I forget now how many hundreds there were, but this was the time when the first Biosphere Reserves were announced. None of them could be officially established by that time, but countries joined enthusiastically, a number of to pledge to designate Biosphere Reserves. And so the first ones were officially designated in 1976. The International Coordinating Council meeting was held in Washington in 1974. I came back to the United States in 1975 and had been invited to be, by Donald King, chair of MAB, to be the coordinator, so-called coordinator of the program. We still had 14 different project areas at that time. And so it was an interesting job. But one of the good things about it was that there was a wonderful woman, Molly Cooks, who had an office right next to mine in the State Department. And so we worked very closely together and often discussed matters. And Molly had the idea that conservation, in order to survive, really needed to be linked up and part of mainstream development programs. And she did her best to convince USA that this should be their policy. But one thing, USA didn't have a great deal of expertise in the environment at that time. And so thanks largely to Molly, she relied a lot on the MAB program, and particularly the forest, the Park Service. We developed a large agreement called the Expanded Information-Based Program, where we did case studies, design aids, ecological aspects of development in the humid tropics, in the arid zone, and coastal zones. Quite a number of publications that were designed for USAID and the host countries. But I decided at that time, one other thing. One time, Dr. King and I were having lunch in the State Department cafeteria. This was 1977. And Don said, what do you think if we could really put the MAB program on the map if we got Lee Talbot? Now, Lee Talbot was a friend at the President's Council for Environmental Quality at that time. This was under Jimmy Carter. And he said, what if we called Lee Talbot and got him to ask, to put into Carter's State of the Union address to the Congress, we need a study of the trends in the environment from now until the year 2000. And I thought, wow, that's a great idea. And so we did call Lee Talbot, and by golly, he got it into President Carter's message. And that was that Global 2000 study was launched. But then things didn't go well. When Carter was defeated and Reagan came in, a lot of things didn't fit the agenda. And he made it known right away. We had really good assistant secretaries for Environment and State Department, Chris Herter and then Lindsey Grant. We had succeeded in getting a memorandum from the Office of Technology Policy and Office of Management and Budget to kind of an authority for MAB to go State Department for the international activities and Interior and Agriculture to do the domestic activities and to do a national plan. And all of that was in process, but then Reagan put Greg Newell in charge, and he actually tried to fire Don King. And couldn't because he was in the executive, Don was in the executive service, so he just moved over to the World Bank. But it got me, and I thought I could do better if I retired, and I did, and took a job with the International Science and Technology Institute to finish the national plan, and then hand carried it to with the signatories from the assistant secretaries of State Department, Agriculture and Interior, and Don King. But it was too late. Things were set. However, the idea of cooperative regional demonstration projects, which was included in this memorandum of 1979 by the Office of Technology Policy and Management and Budget, I suggested calling them cooperative regional demonstration projects, and one of them was to be in the Southern Appalachians. But we didn't get that done. However, I got the opportunity of heading this environmental training and management project in Africa. And we had projects in about 11 different countries, from Ethiopia and Sudan down to Zimbabwe. The program was headquartered in Kenya. And by chance, the regional office, the environmental officer for the regional office, John Godet, was going on leave, and he asked me if I would fill in while he was gone. And it was this period when Greg Newell and his party came out, and I was assigned to brief them on the programs of the UN Environment Program. Well, Greg Newell cut me off within the first couple of sentences and said, we're not here to learn about the UN Environment Program. We're here to cut the budget in half. Well, so be it. However, they didn't cut US aid programs, and we were able to get cooperative regional demonstration projects. We were able to refer to some that are already underway, like Gonzalo Haufter's project in La Micholia Biosphere Reserve in Durango, Mexico, which we'd had a bilateral with the US. So I referred to that. And I referred to the integrated project on arid lands, which is a very fine project in Mount Kiliao and the surrounding desert area in northern Kenya. But mainly the project in the Virunga volcanoes, which is mountain gorilla country. Anyway, we were working particularly with farmers in the surrounding the park, the gorilla park. So I had the chance to present this paper at the First World Congress, which was held in Minsk in Belarusia in 1982, and proposed cooperative regional demonstration projects at that time. But when I returned to the United States, 1984, began to work again on the program in the Southern Appalachians, thankfully with some great help from Bill Gregg, and we got that program established. Then I got back into, Patsy and I moved again. We moved back up to Reston, Virginia, and I got into international work in several parts of the world, and including Lake Baikal in Russia and the Gambia and West Africa and Czechoslovakia, Indonesia. I want to tell you particularly about Indonesia. I told you about Molly Cook's wanting to try to get conservation as a part of mainstream development projects. Well, I had this problem in Indonesia. Our project focuses, they call it integrated protected area lands systems. And it was run by the British Council under the Asian Development Bank. And the Asian Development Bank fellow named, a British guy named Keith Millar asked me one time, we got to be good friends. He said, how much money you got for your project? I said, I think there's over 2-3 years, a couple of $1 million. He said, we waste more money than that in a month. And I said, well, then why don't you join me and see if we can't get the Molly Cook's idea into the Asian Development Bank. We both tried, but it didn't work. Well, I'm getting, let's see, how much time have I got now? I better hurry up. Anyway, I got back in a big way after I came back from Indonesia. I'd heard about the MAB program in the US being in trouble because being accused of violating US sovereignty and property rights and all. And I thought, what's going on? That must be a joke. Well, it wasn't. And I started to work against this group called Sovereignty International. And I learned that Sovereignty International was headed by a guy named Henry Lamb, and he was from Hollow Rock, Tennessee, here in my home state. And Sovereignty International was doing a lot of harm. The American Land Sovereignty Protection Act passed the House, but it didn't pass the Congress. Al Gore was vice president at the time, and he said that they'd veto it if it got to the president's office. But they, in the Congress, attached riders and amendments to appropriation and authorization bills to cut off the funding for that. So we were out again. I mean, it really hurt the program for quite some time. But then I had an opportunity when President George Bush pledged that he would rejoin UNESCO. This was in 2002. And so I had the opportunity to meet with the Undersecretary of Agriculture over the Forest Service. The Forest Service and the Park Service were co-leads, but the Forest Service had the main lead. And Mark Ray had held up filling any positions when it was transferred over from the State Department. But when we rejoined UNESCO, and Mrs. Bush pledged that when she went to UNESCO that we were going to participate fully in UNESCO's programs. So Mark Ray agreed to allow us to start up the MAB program, and particularly the Biosphere Reserve program again, with certain conditions. He wanted it to be certainly decentralized. And I said, well, that's what, Bill Gregg and all the crew were trying to do anyway. I mean, but we formed the US Biosphere Reserves Association, and that carried on for a number of years. And then I was asked to meet with Henry Lamb and stop taking pot shots at each other. This guy in the Congress, the Congress actually began an investigation of MAB. This is under Richard Pombo when he was chair of the House Resources Committee. And we knew that it was not going to be a fair investigation. In fact, it was, anyway, there was a fellow named Kurt Christensen who was going to be the lead investigator. They ordered the Forest Service to turn over all of the materials from the time that the Forest Service took the lead, this 2001, everything, phone notes, emails, all the records to the Congress. And so that happened. But Christensen said, why don't you meet with Henry Lamb? And I did. I agreed to, and met with them for about 5 hours. He brought with him Tom McDonald, who was on their board, and Tom McDonald was also the vice president for the American Sheep Industry Association and a rancher himself. And thank heaven, Tom understood the need for control of invasive species, that sort of thing, which this Kurt Christensen did not. Said that won't fly with us. Tom McDonald also understood the need for conservation of genetic resources important to agriculture and to ranching and so on. So we ended up getting along pretty well. And I said that they did have some good points too, that we should have better criteria about the program and protecting property rights and the like. So we actually got as far as drafting legislation. But it occurred right at the time when the economy took a downturn in 2008. So it didn't get passed. And so it's been I've done what I expected I should not do, and rambled too much. But to get down to today, what are we going to do? What lessons have we learned? And I thought back, okay, we're in such a terrible situation in the world now. And I thought, I've been through a dozen different coups. I just barely got out of the Gambia. And they confiscated our vehicle, and the Bakary Dago, the vice president, who I had visited here in the Southern Appalachians, U.S. sent a carrier in to rescue the president and his family and Bakary Dago. As far as I know, they're still, Dago is still in exile in England. I was just thinking of Ethiopia and Sudan and Zimbabwe and Indonesia and on and on. Programs aren't long enough. They're way too short and connect to deal with the kind of problems that we've got today. But what I think is possible is to use some of the lessons from this. In the Southern Appalachian program, we started a good program with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And called culturally significant plant species. And now we're trying to expand that program, a program on crop wild relatives nationwide using the US Biosphere regions and the opportunities that exist. Just think about it. If in situ conservation is deliberately combined with ex situ conservation, like in botanical gardens and seed banks and community gardens, like Bill Gregg has had a lot of experience with, it could be a way to make a lot more species available, secure and available for use. And just thinking about the need now for securing our food supplies throughout the world. If we could set an example on conservation of crop wild relatives, and you'll be receiving the notice from the group on agriculture pretty soon. I think there will be a workshop in October. The date hasn't been set yet, but it's pretty sure to be in mid-October. So you'll be receiving this, and just think of if we can set an example here in the US for the World Network of Biosphere Reserves, which now some 730 areas in 134 countries. This possibility of combining in situ and ecosystem and ex situ conservation can be a powerful force throughout the world. But there's another very practical thing that we can do. A year or so ago, I joined this Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. I joined on behalf of the George Wright Society. And I've looked at what they are doing. It's a large organization, more than 600 universities and colleges in the US, another couple hundred in Canada, 900 and some odd in the world. And they're doing a lot of good things. And they're at a lot of the universities, the same universities that are supportive of the US Biosphere regions. For example, here at the University of Tennessee, there's a center, and we've met with Jay Price, the director of that center, about collaboration. There's at many of these universities. So when I rejoined, I talked with the manager of the recruitment and development manager. I said, I haven't been able to make much linkages, partnerships, but I think it should be done because the Biosphere Region Organization, the George Wright Society, has expertise that's needed. And I said, and also the fact is that at a lot of these universities, they don't know each other. People at these centers don't know the people that are working in ecology programs and biosphere programs and so on. And she said, well, then why don't we do a webinar? I said, that would be I think, a very good idea. But first, to develop some explanations about our programs and do a little bit of communication beforehand, and then, yeah, prepare a webinar so that we get to know each other and then know where there are opportunities to work together. So those two things are things that I hope I'd like to get your ideas about. The third thing is longer range. We need to begin to think about what we can do to develop the rationale for rejoining UNESCO. And there's no, I understand that Secretary Blinken said recently that there is no objection by Israel. In fact, Israel would be fine if we were to rejoin UNESCO. I don't know what the prospects are, but there are groups that are interested, and we ought to let them know about what you're doing, what the US Biosphere Region Network is doing, what the George Wright Society is doing. And I talked with Dave Reynolds and Dave Harmon. Hey.
You're good. Sorry, somebody's off mute, but
Oh, anyway,
questions here in just a little.
That. How much time have I got? Yeah.
Well, we've only got about 5 minutes till the top of the hour, but if anybody has to go, feel free to go at 8. But Tom, if you're fine hanging out for a little bit, I'm sure people would love to hang on and ask you.
No, I really, I'm sorry. I took.
Oh, you're fine. We are all. I know. I can't speak for everybody, but I'm really enjoying listening to all the history and everything that you're saying. So don't worry about it.
Well, I would like to do with Bill Gregg a better job sometime, but it would take probably a couple of days rather than an hour or so. But what do you think about these ideas, particularly?
So Tom, thank you. I can't thank you enough for this, because one of the questions I had at the start of this was exactly the last topic that you just brought up. I am curious, based on your experience and what you've seen geopolitically, over the years, like, what is the best way for the US to, I know there's been extensive discussions that have been happening about how and if the US should rejoin and what the US should be asking for in order to rejoin UNESCO. So from your opinion and your expertise, what do you think that should look like?
Well, my understanding is that there is some law that prevented when Palestinians are recognized, Palestine is not a state, and I think that the U.S. regulation is that has to be a state to be part of UNESCO. So that means that members of Congress have to be convinced. And I don't know what has been done in the previous administration. I doubt that anything has been done, but I think there was efforts in the Biden administration. I mean, in the administration. So I just have to find out what groups are active now and what their strategy is. But I think I think the administration wants to get back into UNESCO, and the holdup is the Congress.
Thanks so much for that, Tom. So I do want to open up the floor to some more questions. I know I was seeing some questions kind of privately in the chat, so I want to open up the floor to more questions and potentially more comments. I know some people had some comments as well for Tom based on the questions that he phrased at the end of it. So Sam, go for it.
Hi, Tom. First of all, I want to again say thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I would very happily join you in Tennessee and just let you tell me all of these stories. But one of the things that I'm curious about is, based off of your experience and the cooperation that you were able to facilitate with the USSR during the 1970s, and how it led to the creation of the Biosphere program internationally. How, if at all, do you see the MAB program playing a peacekeeping role in the future, considering the current geopolitical landscape?
Well, a lot of the conflict in the world has to do with resources, and particularly, food and water, with climate change, climate warming occurring much more rapidly than I think that the more we can do to demonstrate how we can secure many more species, not just for food, but for medicine, for a variety of things. That is more of a way to get the public interested and to work toward peace than anything that I know of, because there really is a growing food crisis in the world. And I think there's an awful lot that we can do, particularly in the United States. But I think that even with this project that we've got on crop wild relatives, if we demonstrate the value of that, I showed earlier the picture of the Tennessee sunflower, and in this joint strategic framework on crop wild relatives, they talk about the value of the sunflower wild relatives, which is native to the U.S. The one I showed was the Tennessee sunflower. It goes into the several $100,000. And I just know from experience in so many different countries that there are many ways, and Bill Gregg certainly knows, I mean, with the community garden, the Ranson community gardens that he got started, there are ways to help people, and that helps to prevent conflict, because a lot of the conflicts come about in competition over resources. Does that make sense? I mean,
that makes perfect sense. I completely agree.
Of course, there are many other ways. I wish you would look at this book. This book, The Internationalists, how how the world how a radical plan to outlaw war changed the world. This is a fast. I've got it on audio tape. I've listened to it 3 times, and it's a history that's so well researched that I could listen to it a dozen times and still not know a fraction of what. But look this up, The Internationalists, because it really is, I think, the most informative book that I've read in years.
Hey, Tom, we have a question in the chat from Bruce Byers. He wants to know, in addition to congratulating you on a wonderful talk, he wants to know that kind of beyond the suggestions that you've already made, how we can pass the torch, so to speak, to the next generation to take care of our global biosphere. He wants to know if you're hopeful about that and if you think that they, aka I guess we, can do it.
Well, I've just been really enjoying reading his beautifully written book, A View from Cascade Head, Lessons for the Biosphere. And I think a lot of the lessons that we need to know are in this book. But if I were completely honest, and I don't know whether that's possible or not, but no, I'm just not that hopeful. I mean, I agree with Frank Darling that it's certainly no good to be a defeatist, and I'm all for doing whatever we can. But looking at what we've tried and you know, programs that were really good, they're not long enough, they're not effective enough, and yet we've got to keep on trying, and who knows, maybe. I mean, the news this evening was pretty good. Most of it pretty good about this this new possibility of this new bill. I'm a bit like Jerry Olson. Jerry Olson was a climate scientist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and he joined us when we first had these regional meetings. When I returned from UNESCO in 1975, and we had a whole series of regional meetings. And Jerry attended all of them, I think, and his advocacy at the time was setting up plots and transects, plots in vegetation transition zones so that we could monitor changes in climate in low-lying coastal areas. And a lot of that was done. But Virginia Dale, another very distinguished scientist at the Oak Ridge National Lab, said, Jerry Olson died last year, and Virginia and a number wrote a tribute to him, but she said that they asked him not long before he died, what do you think about this? And he said, we can just hang on for the ride. And I think that's, even if we don't do any more than hang on for the ride, we've got to do that. So gosh, Bruce, I don't know how to answer the question, but honestly, I don't. Maybe because I'm so old, but I'm not as hopeful as I was. What do you all think? I mean, the hope is in with all of you who are so much younger. Kelly, what do you think?
To be honest, Tom, the group of us that are involved in the youth board have been buoyed by actions of folk just like yourself. And to be perfectly frank, we're aware of the situation that we're in, but you and people like you have paved a path of perseverance that we are happy to pick up. And I think you have earned the right to be cynical based off of all that you've gone through in just what we've covered today. But do know that there are a good number of us who share your honest assessment, but will not stop fighting.
Well, I don't want to ever stop. I don't think I ever will.
I'm not sure if you're capable of stopping. I think you've proved that repeatedly after you talked about 40 years worth of history involving multiple coups and a congressional investigation and a beef with a fellow Tennessean. I think you've shown the fighting spirit is alive and well.
Well, you do have some wins. Henry Lamb, I actually got to where I like him, even though he and his crew were the ones chiefly responsible for getting the Senate not to ratify the Biodiversity Treaty. And he wrote a book called The Rise in Global Governance. Oh my. Anyway, Henry said after we did come to a compromise situation, he said, you know, I feel like we've climbed a high mountain and the view on the other side is much better than I imagined it could be. Well, that made me feel pretty good. So, of course, it didn't take long for that view to cloud over again. Yeah,
I want to bring attention to something Bruce just wrote that I think is really powerful in the chat. And Bruce, feel free to take yourself off of mute if you want to share this yourself, because I think what you wrote is really the key to what the future holds for us. Bruce, if you want to take yourself off mute, otherwise I'm happy to read it on your behalf. Totally up to you.
Okay, I took myself off of mute, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm not putting myself on video because I'm not in a good setting for that. But no, in some recent research for a new book about the Golden Gate and the Channel Islands Biosphere Reserves regions in California, I have asked dozens of elders of our elders like Tom, are they hopeful? And one of the key answers that I get, it's like, no, we aren't hopeful. We're not optimistic, but we just have to keep doing what gives our lives meaning. And to me, that's a very, very powerful motivation, I guess I would say, and a very hopeful, I guess, yeah, sort of torch to pass on to the next generation, which is, yeah, wherever this is going, you just have to do what you know is right. And so that's where we need these models like Tom, like others of our elders, to inspire us. So, yeah. Thanks, Tom.
well, thank all of you. I really was nervous about it, but I'm glad to do it. I'd like to try it again.
Anytime. And we are happy to have you.
When I learn more about the technology.
You did great, Tom. You did awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I think on that note, maybe a little bit of a hopeful note, we can kind of wrap things up here. does anyone else have any kind of last questions or comments or anything before we kind of wrap things up?
Well, this is John Dennis. I'd just like to say thank you, Tom. I really appreciated your taking the time to go through some of the history, and I have greatly appreciated all of the contributions you have made, especially helping us get restarted in 2013 by figuring out a strategy that would get the biosphere regions, now regions, willing to start doing the paperwork, knowing that what we were doing might be rejected by MAB, but it would get the impetus going so we could then do it in a way that MAB would appreciate and accept. And we succeeded with 28 biosphere regions making it through that hurdle. And it was your stimulus, I believe, that got us there. So thank you.
Gee, I didn't know you were there. You know, I feel a little bit like when I gave a talk one time and the regional director was in the audience and I didn't know it. I might have been more careful if I'd have known.
You were very careful. Thank you.
Bill has something to say?
I just want to say sort of same thing Bruce did and John. I mean, just to thank Tom for sharing this half a century of perspective on this program. Tom was my mentor, my guiding light, you know, whatever I was able to accomplish in the 80s and 90s when MAB fortunately was still active. I owe in substantial degree to the guidance that Tom provided. You know, you can always, you look at the biosphere regions, which I think it's a term of elegance for describing what we do. And that all started back, not with the same name, but it began in the Southern Appalachians with the different units, with different research missions and conservation missions. And now with the Biosphere Reserve region concept, we've added the development function, the sustainable ecosystem function, sustainable development function, which was building all through the 80s and 90s. But with this concept, which I really do trace back to the pairing of those three areas, the Oak Ridge, Coweta, and the Smokies. The essence of the biosphere region concept was in those three areas, which Tom really helped to bring together and add to it. Now we have this wonderful program with the Cherokees. We've been seeing, you know, we were all federal at the beginning, and now we're way beyond federal. We were individual sites that had the Biosphere Reserve designation. It was sort of an overlay. Well, you know, through the 80s and 90s and in the current day, we're adding not only administrative sites, but people that know how to do a whole variety of things. And the Biosphere Reserve region, I think it's unique. The network of Biosphere Reserve, Biosphere regions, far better term than Biosphere Reserves, because we're a lot more than reserves. We're people, people doing really good things. And I think that's what excites the younger people. I think we all recognize that. Those of us who are, Tom's a little older than I am, but I'm no spring chicken either. And we love this program. We've loved it from day one. And Tom particularly has been the glue that's held us together. He's been willing to work with some pretty cantankerous forces that could have been opponents, maybe were for a while, but he's brought them around. And I was not, you know, I guess I had too much testosterone in the way I looked at it. Tom was always brought humility and overriding concern for nature and the environment, but also people. And I think what we're doing with the Cherokees, we need to replicate some of these things that are being done in the biosphere regions. And I look at some of the other regions, which actually do go way back, you know, the Champlain Adirondacks, the Pinelands, there are a lot of them. And, you know, we did have an initiative 20 years ago, 20 in 2000. And the idea basically was to provide a little seed money to see what the Biosphere Reserves could do to build toward this biosphere region idea. And unfortunately, we didn't get them. We got a couple of them started, but then the program fell on ill times and so forth. It's fallen on ill times any number of times, but I think we're on a roll. I am so happy to see all these young professionals getting excited about what got me excited, what got Tom excited before me, before there really was a biosphere reserve region idea. But I think now it's time to turn it over and get to work. I am distressed about what's happening. Just Tom mentioned he is, so am I, about what's going on with the environment. But let's take it day by day, do the best we can, and feel confident, I think, at least right now, that we may be turning a corner. At least I hope so. So thanks, Tom, for all of your wonderful experience. I hope we can do this again and share more of it, because I think that's really important to those of us who are.
Thank you all. Talking about turning the corner, I've been talking with Dr. Ishwaran, who now heads a big program called Deep Time Digital Earth. And he told me that the next Biosphere Congress will be hosted by China in Beijing in 2025. That's not long off. I hope that somehow or another we can be represented there. Anyway, let's scheme about how we might be able to. I asked Ish if we couldn't get on the agenda, at least the subject of conservation of genetic resources again. So, were you aware that this? I hope that Ish is right, and that the next meeting, the World Congress, will be in China.
I heard that as well from Ish. I don't know the details on it, but we'll see what happens in 2025, right? Because that could be, it's an interesting setting, again, considering the geopolitics with UNESCO and how China is factoring into that, but whole nother workshop on that. But so with that, I will, I personally just want to say thank you again. This was so informative, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all of this wisdom and for passing the torch on to us, Tom. It means more than you know. So thank you, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Marissa. And yeah, so Marissa, I'll turn it to you to wrap up.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you, Tom, again, so much for joining us. And I just echo Kelly and thank you for sharing us all your wisdom and all the history. It's so awesome to have kind of that context of this wasn't always easy. Like we've had our struggles kind of getting things restarted here in the last few years, and just, I don't know, to know that, yeah, that there have been lots of bumps in the road, but we've always overcome them. And it's, you know, very heartening to see that. So we thank you so much for trying to be here. We thank everybody who was able to hop on. I will remind everyone that we did record this session and we will be posting that Kelly, do you know where we're going to be posting that? We'll be putting that on our Facebook page.
Sure. We'll post it on the YouTube site and then we'll send it via email to everyone. So if somebody couldn't make it, you can share it via email as well. So we'll put it on our USBN YouTube.
Yes, I know we've had several requests from people who had to hop off early that they would love to see the recording. So I think it will be very much watched. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, great.